The road that led out of Ashbury Ridge didn't appear on most navigation systems, and even the ones that tried to recognize it often lost connection halfway through the stretch where the land opened into pale winter fields, and the sky seemed lower than it should have been, pressing down in a quiet, colorless way that made everything feel distant. And Victoria Hale, who had built her entire life on control, precision, and the absolute certainty of knowing where she was going at every moment, found herself sitting inside a stalled black SUV, watching the dashboard flicker with a warning she didn't immediately trust, her fingers resting lightly against the steering wheel as she stared through the windshield at a landscape that offered no urgency, no movement, no sign that the world cared whether she reached her destination on time or not. And for a woman who had spent 15 years building Hale Urban Group into one of the most aggressive redevelopment firms on the East Coast, that lack of control felt less like inconvenience and more like disruption. She wasn't lost. Victoria Hale didn't get lost, but she was paused, and pausing was something she had never learned to do properly. The warning indicator was minor, likely temperature related, given the freezing conditions. But she wasn't someone who ignored small risks, because in her experience, small risks were rarely small. They were early versions of larger failures waiting to happen, and she had built her reputation on eliminating failure before it had a chance to exist, which was exactly why she had driven herself out to Ashbury Ridge that morning instead of delegating the inspection to one of her analysts. Because the land she was evaluating wasn't just another project, it was an expansion opportunity that could redefine the company's next 5 years. 300 acres of underdeveloped terrain, positioned just far enough from the city to be transformed into something profitable, something controlled, something that could be reshaped into value. The engine didn't die, but she turned it off anyway. And when she stepped out into the cold, the air hit her with a clarity she wasn't prepared for, sharp and immediate, finding its way through the seams of her coat, as if the environment itself was reminding her that she was no longer operating in a space she controlled. And for a brief moment she stood there, looking across the open land, calculating distance, direction, and the most efficient way to regain control of the situation. That's when she saw it. Not far from the road, partially obscured by a thin line of trees, there was a house, if it could be called that. It wasn't structured for appearance, wasn't built to impress or even to endure in the way modern architecture intended. It was something older, something maintained rather than designed, a place that existed not because it followed a plan, but because someone had chosen to keep it standing despite everything that might have suggested it shouldn't. A faint line of smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was there. Victoria hesitated, not because she lacked confidence, but because entering unknown spaces without control was not something she preferred. Still, standing outside wasn't a solution. So she walked. The distance felt longer than it should have, each step crunching against the hardened snow, the silence around her almost unnatural in its consistency. And by the time she reached the porch, she had already begun to feel something unfamiliar. Not discomfort exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when you step into a place that operates under different rules than your own. She knocked. The door opened quickly. The man standing there didn't look surprised, which, for reasons she couldn't immediately explain, irritated her slightly. He was older than her by a few years, maybe more, but not in a way that suggested decline, rather in a way that suggested experience, the kind that wasn't performed or explained, just carried, visible in the lines of his face, the steadiness of his posture, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. Behind him, a young girl sat at a table, a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading. She was watching, observing in a way that felt deliberate, as if she was deciding what category Victoria belonged in. My car, Victoria said, direct as always. Temperature warning. I need to call for service. The man stepped aside. "Come in." Not an invitation, a decision. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria entered a space where she wasn't the one in control. And the difference was immediate, not because anything inside the house demanded attention, but because nothing did. The room did not rearrange itself around her presence. The way boardrooms did, it did not acknowledge her position, her authority, or the years she had spent becoming someone whose arrival usually altered the atmosphere of a space. Instead, the house remained exactly as it was, small, warm, functional, and quietly complete without her, which unsettled her more than any open resistance would have. The interior was simple, not in the curated way of minimal design, but in the honest way of necessity. Exposed wooden beams that had aged naturally rather than intentionally, a stove in the corner providing steady heat, and beside it, partially dismantled, a small mechanical unit laid out with precise order, each component arranged with care on a folded cloth, as if the act of repairing it required not just skill, but attention. And attention, she realized, was something she hadn't truly practiced in years. "There's a landline in the kitchen," the man said, already turning back toward the heater without waiting for acknowledgement. And that, more than anything else, struck her as unusual. Not the instruction itself, but the lack of engagement. He had not asked who she was, had not shown curiosity, had not adjusted himself in response to her presence. He had simply allowed her in and continued what he was doing, as if she were a passing condition rather than an event. Victoria moved toward the kitchen. She made the call, spoke efficiently, confirmed service. And then, instead of leaving immediately as she should have, she found herself standing there, looking through the small window above the sink, watching the empty field beyond it, the snow falling in quiet, steady layers that didn't demand attention, yet filled the entire landscape. She should have left, but she didn't. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze returning to the main room, to the man working with steady hands, to the girl now drawing quietly at the table, and before she could filter the thought, before she could adjust the tone into something more socially acceptable, she spoke. "Why are you living like this?" The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was analytical, the way she approached everything. The man didn't respond immediately. He adjusted a small component, tested its movement, and only then looked at her, his expression calm, not defensive, not offended, just steady. "Because this is the only place she still feels her mother is here," he said. And just like that, the conversation ended before it had begun. Victoria didn't respond, not because she chose silence, but because for the first time in a long time, she didn't have anything to say. Her mind processed information quickly, efficiently, categorizing, evaluating, translating everything into measurable terms. But this didn't fit into anything she knew how to measure. There was no metric for grief anchored in place, no valuation model for memory preserved through environment, no strategic framework that explained why someone would remain in a space that offered so little by her standards, yet clearly held something she couldn't define. She glanced at the girl. The child had already returned to her drawing, as if the answer had been sufficient, as if no further explanation was required. Victoria ended the call, thanked him, though the words felt smaller than they should have, and left. She was back in the city before nightfall, the transition from isolation to controlled urban structure happening so quickly it almost felt unreal. Glass buildings replacing open fields, movement replacing stillness. And by the time she reached her penthouse, everything had returned to its expected rhythm. Her assistant had left the daily reports on the counter. Meetings were scheduled, decisions awaited her input, and the world she understood resumed its place around her. But something had shifted, not externally, internally. She sat at the counter looking at the documents she was supposed to review, but instead of reading them, her mind returned to the house. The heater components laid out in sequence, the quiet concentration of the man repairing something without reference, the child drawing with complete focus, and most of all, the answer. Not emotional, not dramatic, just final. She opened the acquisition file, reviewed the land map, located the exact section where the house stood, northeast quadrant, primary development zone, the most valuable section. She closed the file, and for the first time in years, she hesitated. The next morning, she did what she always did. She moved forward. She instructed her assistant to prepare acquisition offers, structured, generous, efficient, 30% above valuation, relocation support, timeline flexibility, everything designed to remove resistance. Because in her experience, resistance wasn't emotional, it was logistical. And if you removed the logistical barriers, people agreed. That's how the world worked. At least that's how her world worked. But when she returned to the house with the offer in hand, everything unfolded differently. The man read the documents carefully, did not rush, did not react. And when he finished, he handed them back. No, one word, clear, final, without negotiation, without explanation. And then the girl appeared beside him, looked up at Victoria, and asked simply, "Are you taking our home?" The question carried no accusation, which made it heavier. Victoria stood there, holding the folder, processing something she had not encountered in over a decade. Not refusal, but absolute refusal. Not strategic, not emotional, just truth. "We're not selling memories," the man said, and closed the door. That moment stayed with her, not because she lost the deal, but because she didn't understand the decision, and not understanding something was unacceptable. So she went back, not with an offer, but with questions. And what she found changed everything. So she went back, not with an offer this time, not with documents or structured proposals or numbers designed to persuade, but with something far less familiar to her: uncertainty. And that alone altered the way she approached the house, the way she walked up the same path, now partially covered with fresh snow, the way she paused before knocking, because this time she wasn't entering to take control of a situation. She was entering without knowing what the outcome would be, and for someone like Victoria Hale, that was not just unusual, it was deeply uncomfortable. The door opened again, just as quickly as before, and again he didn't look surprised. "You came back," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. "Yes," she replied, and for a moment she almost added something else, something that would justify her presence in a way she was used to doing, something professional, something structured. But she stopped herself because this time she didn't want to lead the conversation. She wanted to understand it. He stepped aside again, not inviting, not questioning, just allowing. And that simple act, repeated without variation, began to reveal something to her that she hadn't recognized before. This man didn't operate through reaction. He didn't adjust himself based on who stood in front of him. He remained consistent, grounded in something internal rather than external, and that alone made him difficult to navigate. Inside, nothing had changed. The same heater components, the same table, the same quiet presence of the girl, who this time looked at Victoria a little longer before returning to her drawing. Victoria didn't go to the kitchen. She didn't call anyone. She didn't open her folder. Instead, she stayed where she was. "You refused the offer," she said, though the statement felt unnecessary. "Yes." "No negotiation?" "No." "Even at a higher value?" "No." Every answer was the same, clear, uncomplicated, and completely resistant to the system she understood. "Why?" she asked finally. He looked at her again, not impatient, not defensive, just still. "Because you're not buying land," he said. "You're asking me to leave the only place my daughter still understands her mother existed." There it was again. not emotion, not explanation, just truth. And this time, Victoria didn't move past it. She stayed with it. What happened? She asked. And this time, he didn't answer immediately. Not because he refused, but because he considered the question, which meant something. She died here, he said finally, 2 winters ago. The room didn't change. Nothing dramatic happened. But the weight of the space shifted in a way Victoria could feel, even if she couldn't fully define it. How? She asked. A road accident, he replied, just beyond the ridge. And something about that answer didn't settle, not because it was emotional, but because it was incomplete. Victoria had spent her life recognizing incomplete information. It was what allowed her to make decisions others couldn't. And now, she recognized it again. She didn't press further. Not there, not yet. Instead, she left. Again. But this time, she didn't return to her life the same way. Back in the city, she opened the file again, but not the acquisition file, a different one: public records, transportation reports, incident logs, insurance filings, everything connected to that road, that location, that winter. Because something about his answer didn't align, not with the tone, not with the silence that followed it, not with the way the girl had stopped drawing for a moment when he said it. It took less than 12 hours, because information, when you know where to look, doesn't stay hidden for long. The report she found was brief, too brief. Single vehicle accident, severe weather conditions, driver lost control, fatality confirmed, case closed. Victoria leaned back in her chair, reading it again, then again. And something about it didn't make sense. Not the words, the absence of them. No witness statements, no extended investigation, no liability review. Just closed, efficient, convenient. That's when she noticed something else, a company name buried in the documentation. One she recognized, one connected to regional infrastructure maintenance, one that had contracts with her firm. Now it wasn't just incomplete, it was connected. She went back the next day, not as a developer, not as a negotiator, but as someone who now had a reason to question something beyond land value. When he opened the door this time, she didn't wait. "The report doesn't match what happened," she said. That got his attention. Not dramatically, but enough. He didn't step aside immediately. He looked at her, longer this time, measuring, evaluating. "You've been looking into it," he said. "Yes." "Why?" Because she didn't understand. Because incomplete systems bothered her. Because something didn't align. Because for the first time in years, something mattered that wasn't about profit. But she didn't say all that. Instead, she said the simplest version of the truth. Because it doesn't make sense. That was enough. This time he stepped aside slower, and when she entered, the conversation changed. "She didn't lose control," he said before she even asked. The road failed. Victoria stayed quiet, listening. "The maintenance contract was reassigned 2 weeks before the accident," he continued. "Budget cuts, reduced inspections. They signed off on conditions that weren't safe." Victoria's mind moved quickly, too quickly, cross-referencing, connecting, realizing. Her company hadn't built the road, but they had acquired the firm that approved the maintenance changes. 6 months later, after the accident, after the case was closed. "You didn't fight it," she said. "I tried," he replied, "but I didn't have the resources, and they had already finalized everything." He didn't say it with anger, he said it like fact, which made it worse. Victoria didn't speak immediately, because now this wasn't abstract, this wasn't theoretical, this was direct, her world, her system, her industry, connected to something real, something irreversible, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't looking at numbers, she was looking at consequence. "What was her name?" Victoria asked quietly. He didn't hesitate this time. "Elena." The girl looked up again, and for the first time, she spoke directly to Victoria. "You're not taking our house anymore, right?" Victoria looked at her, at the drawing on the table, at the man who had refused everything she offered, at the space that held more weight than anything she had built in the city, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't calculate the answer. "No," she said, "I'm not." That was the moment everything changed. Not for the deal, not for the land, but for her. And that was the moment everything changed. Not in a dramatic way that announced itself loudly, not in a way that the outside world would immediately recognize, but in a quiet internal shift that restructured how Victoria understood everything she had built her life on, because for years she had believed that control meant clarity, that efficiency meant correctness, that if a system worked, it didn't need to be questioned. And yet, standing there in that small, worn house, looking at a child who measured the world not in outcomes but in presence, and a man who had chosen memory over money without hesitation, she realized something she had never truly considered before. Systems don't fail loudly, they fail quietly. And when they do, the consequences don't show up in reports, they show up in lives. She didn't return to the city the same way. The drive back felt different, not because the road had changed, but because she had. The landscape no longer looked empty. It looked specific. Every stretch of land carrying context she had ignored before, every intersection representing a decision made by someone who might never see its outcome. And by the time she reached her office, the glass walls that once felt like symbols of achievement now felt distant, like they belonged to a version of herself she wasn't entirely aligned with anymore. Her assistant greeted her with updates, meetings, timelines, approvals, all waiting, all urgent, all expected. But instead of stepping into that rhythm immediately, Victoria walked past her desk into her office, closed the door, and for the first time since founding her company, she didn't open her laptop right away. She sat in silence and allowed herself to think without direction. The next move she made was not impulsive. It was deliberate, and it carried weight. She called for a full internal audit, not the standard procedural review that companies conducted to maintain compliance, but a deep investigation into the acquisition chain, specifically the firm connected to the road maintenance contract from 2 years prior. And when her executive team questioned the scope, questioned the urgency, questioned the relevance to current operations, she didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. "This isn't optional," she said, and that was enough. The findings came back within days, faster than expected. Because when systems are built on efficiency rather than scrutiny, information is often easier to uncover than people assume. The maintenance firm had reduced inspection frequency under cost saving directives. Those directives had been approved internally. No external verification required. The conditions were marked acceptable. They were not. The accident had been recorded, filed, closed, without escalation, without liability, because the process allowed it. Victoria read the report alone, line by line, twice. And when she finished, she didn't feel anger. She felt something more complex, responsibility, not because she had made the decision personally, but because she had built the structure that allowed decisions like that to exist without consequence. She returned to Ashbury Ridge the next morning, not with documents, not with offers, but with truth. When he opened the door, he already knew, not what she had found, but that something had shifted. "You came back," he said again. "Yes," she replied. This time he didn't wait for explanation. He stepped aside, and she entered. The girl was there, drawing again, same table, same quiet focus. But this time, Victoria noticed what she was drawing: a road, a car, and a figure standing beside it. Victoria didn't sit. She didn't move further into the room. She stayed near the entrance. "I found the report," she said. He didn't respond. Not yet. They knew the road wasn't safe, she continued. They approved it anyway. A pause. Then, and? He asked. Because information alone meant nothing. Not anymore. Victoria met his gaze. For 2 years, nothing was done, she said. No investigation, no accountability, because the system allowed it. And now? He asked. And that was the question. The only one that mattered. She could have handled it quietly, contained it, adjusted internally, protected the company, protected her position. That's what she would have done before, without hesitation, without conflict. But she wasn't that person anymore. I'm reopening it, she said. He didn't react immediately, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. And the company? He asked. They'll be exposed, she replied. And you? He said. Victoria didn't answer right away, because for the first time, the answer affected her directly, not strategically, not professionally, personally. I built the system, she said finally. That makes it my responsibility. The room stayed quiet, not tense, just still. The girl looked up, studied Victoria, then asked softly, Will it change anything? And there it was. The simplest question, the hardest one to answer. Victoria stepped closer this time. Not fully, but enough. Yes, she said. And for once, she wasn't calculating the outcome. The process that followed was not clean. It was not controlled. It was not efficient. Because truth rarely is. Internal resistance came first, executives pushing back, legal teams advising containment, investors raising concerns. Because exposure meant risk, risk meant loss, loss meant instability. But Victoria didn't step back, for the first time in her career. She moved forward without protecting the structure she had built. The case was reopened. Publicly, investigations expanded, records re examined, decisions traced, names identified, and when the findings were released, they didn't disappear into quiet filings. They made impact. The firm responsible was held accountable, the approvals were exposed, the failures acknowledged, and most importantly, the accident was no longer just a closed report. It became recognized for what it was: negligence. Victoria's company didn't escape it. They couldn't, nor did she try to make them. Press conferences followed, statements issued, responsibility accepted, not redirected, not minimized, owned. And in doing so, something unexpected happened. The company didn't collapse, it changed. Because for the first time, it was built on something other than control. Weeks later, Victoria returned to the house one last time. Not as part of the process, not because something was unresolved, but because something was. When she knocked, the girl opened the door this time. You came back, she said. Yes, Victoria replied. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The man stood by the window, looked at her, and for the first time, there was no distance in it. They told me, he said, what you did. Victoria nodded. That doesn't bring her back, he added. I know, she said. A pause. Then, but it matters, he continued. That was enough. Victoria didn't stay long. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about closure. It wasn't about resolution. It was about understanding something she had never been forced to understand before. As she stepped outside, the same road stretched ahead of her, the same fields, the same sky. But this time, she wasn't just passing through it. She was aware of it, and that changed everything. Some decisions build success, some decisions build systems. But the ones that matter most are the ones that rebuild what those systems forgot. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Hale understood the difference.